This is a case that looks like an urban legend until you check the court transcripts. A 12-year-old girl, four teenage girls, a night of jealousy, manipulation, and escalating violence that would leave Indiana and Kentucky stunned for decades. The murder of Shanda Sharer isn't just shocking because of what happened, it's shocking because of who did it. Middle-class teenage girls with no criminal history, no gang ties, no long arc of violence. Just dysfunction, jealousy, loneliness, and one ringleader who knew exactly how to weaponize insecurity. This story unfolds like a slow detonation, a custody dispute, a stolen girlfriend, a prank that turns into abduction, and a group of teenagers who cross a line that most adults can't even imagine. Tonight, we're walking through every step of the night of January 10th, 1992, the planning, the abduction, the torture, the fire, and the aftermath, not for shock value, not for theatrics, but because the truth is the only way to understand how a group of young girls ended up committing one of the most horrific murders in American history. This is Deadly Truths, and this is the story of Shanda Sharer. Shanda Sharer was 12, new to town, kind, bright, a cheerleader. Still figuring out who she was, she met Amanda Heverin, a slightly older girl, and the two clicked immediately. It was innocent at first, but it didn't stay that way. The friendship turned intense, then romantic, and it caught the attention of someone who did not take rejection well. Melinda Lovelace, 16, Amanda's ex-girlfriend, possessive, volatile, and already cracking under the pressure of a collapsing home life. Melinda was obsessed with Amanda, obsessed with controlling her, watching her, punishing anyone she thought was replacing her. And that meant one thing, Shanda. The jealousy spiraled fast. Melinda started threatening Shanda at school, handwritten notes, whispered warnings, a promise that she would hurt her if she didn't stay away from Amanda. Teachers and counselors later said the tension was obvious, but no one expected violence, certainly not this kind of violence. Meanwhile, Melinda wasn't alone. She had access to something dangerous, a small group of girls who were older, angrier, and easier to influence. Lori Tackett, 17, intense, unpredictable, fascinated by the occult. Hope Rippey, 15, eager to fit in. Tony Lawrence, 15, anxious, insecure, and desperate for approval. Together, these four girls became a pressure cooker. And Melinda fed them one message: Shanda deserves to be taught a lesson. By January 1992, that lesson had a plan behind it. And that plan involved luring Shanda out of her house under the lie of meeting Amanda. A lie that would put Shanda directly into the hands of four girls who had no idea how far they were about to go. January 10th, 1992. A cold Friday night with nothing that should have stood out, Shanda was supposed to spend the evening at her dad's house, then return to her mom's later. It was an ordinary custody weekend. Routine, predictable, safe. Around 8:30 p.m., a car carrying Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence pulled up outside the house. They told Shanda they were there to take her to see Amanda. Shanda didn't know these girls, but she trusted the name they used. Amanda was the girl she liked, the one she'd been spending time with, and despite the tension with Melinda, the idea of seeing Amanda felt comforting. Shanda stepped outside but ultimately asked the girls to come back later after her family was asleep. They drove off, circling aimlessly, building up nerve they didn't realize they'd need by the time they returned close to midnight. Excitement had shifted into something darker and heavier. They had already decided what the night was going to be. When Shanda walked out the second time, she was relaxed, smiling, and thinking she was going to see Amanda. She climbed into the car, completely unaware that Melinda Lovelace was hiding under a blanket in the back seat, gripping a knife and vibrating with jealousy and anger. The moment the car pulled away, Shanda sensed something was wrong. She didn't see Amanda. She didn't recognize the girls around her. The conversation died instantly, and the atmosphere shifted from awkward to threatening. Then Melinda burst out from under the blanket, knife in hand, and held it to Shanda's throat. This wasn't a scare tactic or a bluff. Melinda had come specifically to confront her, and she made it clear, "Don't you ever try to take Amanda from me." From there, the ride turned into a nightmare. Shanda couldn't escape. She begged to know what was happening, but none of the girls answered in any meaningful way. Lori kept driving. Hope stared forward, and Tony withdrew into herself, already panicking about what they had agreed to. The girls drove Shanda across the river into rural Kentucky, heading toward an isolated stone ruin known as the Witch's Castle. A local hangout tied to ghost stories, dares, and teenage myth. It was abandoned, silent, and far enough from town that no one would hear anything happening inside. That was the destination. And at this point, Shanda realized she wasn't being taken to see Amanda. She wasn't being taught a lesson. She was being taken somewhere no one could help her. Lori drove deep into rural Jefferson County until the houses and streetlights were gone, and the only thing visible through the windows was tree line and black sky. The witch's castle sat on a hill overlooking the woods, an old, half-collapsed stone structure teenagers used for drinking, dares, and scaring each other. It was a place where no one lived, no one patrolled, and no one accidentally stumbled in. They dragged Shanda out of the car and marched her toward the ruin. She was shaking, crying, trying to understand what she'd done to make any of this happen. She kept asking for Amanda. She kept asking why Melinda hated her so much. None of them gave her an answer. Inside the abandoned structure, Melinda immediately escalated the situation. She forced Shanda to take off her jewelry and her clothes, mocking her, taunting her, and using the knife as a constant threat. Shanda tried to reason with her, offering to stop seeing Amanda entirely, begging them just to take her home. It didn't matter. Melinda was locked into a fantasy of control and revenge, and the other girls were too intimidated or too insecure to stop her. Melinda punched her, pulled her hair, and held the knife under her chin while screaming threats. For Shanda, this wasn't a fight. She was 12, surrounded, freezing, terrified, and overwhelmed. The situation shifted from threats to violence with almost no transition. Every time she cried or pleaded, Melinda seemed more energized, as if fear itself was the reaction she'd been waiting for. Lori paced around the room, feeding off the chaos. Hope laughed nervously, unsure what to do but unwilling to oppose Melinda. Tony stood back, already breaking, trying not to look directly at Shanda. At one point, Melinda pressed the knife to Shanda's chest so hard that it left a visible mark. Then she leaned in close and asked her the same question over and over. "Do you still want Amanda? Do you think you can take her from me?" Shanda promised she didn't. She promised she wasn't trying to. She promised she just wanted to go home. None of it mattered. After several minutes of intimidation and threats inside the castle, the girls forced Shanda back into the car. They weren't finished. The violence hadn't run its course. Melinda wasn't ready to let go of the rage she'd built up for months. And the worst part was this. The night was only beginning. They shoved Shanda back into the car, freezing, humiliated, and terrified. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. Melinda climbed in beside her, still gripping the knife, still feeding off the control she finally felt she had. The car smelled like cold air and sweat and fear. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Lori got behind the wheel again. Hope and Tony sat rigid and silent, staring straight ahead. Melinda kept Shanda pressed against her side, knife at her throat, whispering threats that only Shanda could hear. The drive was long, winding, and pitch black. Nothing but back roads and wooded stretches where no one would see a car pulled over. At one point, Melinda ordered Lori to stop. They pulled over near a gravel turnout in the middle of nowhere. The temperature had dropped even more by then, and the night was so still that every sound seemed amplified. Breathing, footsteps, sobbing. They dragged Shanda out again. Her legs were weak, but Melinda held her upright by her hair. Lori walked around them like she was sizing up the moment, feeding off Melinda's energy. Hope followed, trying to act tougher than she felt. Tony hung back again, shaking, quietly begging Lori to stop this and take Shanda home, but Lori brushed her off. Melinda pushed Shanda against the side of the car and held the knife to her chest. Shanda begged, cried, promised anything she could think of. She tried to reach for the door, tried to get away, but she was overpowered immediately. Then Melinda stabbed her in the chest. Not deep, more of a puncture meant to terrorize her, but it was enough to send Shanda into pure panic. She screamed and collapsed. The girls got scared, panicked themselves, and rushed her back into the car, thinking someone might hear. Nobody did. They were miles from anything. Shanda lay curled on the back seat, bleeding, sobbing, and shaking uncontrollably. She kept whispering, "Please, please, I just want to go home." But Melinda wasn't done. The first stab hadn't satisfied her, and the others were too afraid of her to intervene. They still had the entire night ahead of them and no clear plan. Just rage, fear, and a mess of decisions they didn't know how to reverse. Lori suggested they go somewhere even more isolated, a place she knew well, a place where screams wouldn't carry and headlights wouldn't be seen, a place she'd taken other friends before when she wanted to scare them. The woods near a remote stretch of logging road. Melinda agreed instantly. They drove deeper into rural Indiana, away from the castle, away from the turnout, away from any chance Shanda had of being found alive. What came next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't teaching a lesson. It was premeditated brutality driven by jealousy, insecurity, and the worst group dynamic imaginable. One unstable leader and 3 followers too scared and too lost to stop her. And by the time they reached the woods, Shanda was already fading in and out, whispering for help that wasn't coming. Lori drove deeper into the back roads until the pavement ended and the trees closed in tight on both sides. It was the kind of place where headlights disappeared after 20 feet, where sound didn't carry, and where there was no chance, none, that anyone was going to stumble across them by accident. They pulled off near a logging trail. The engine clicked as it cooled, and the air was so cold that every breath fogged in front of them. Shanda could barely sit up. She was shivering, crying, and bleeding lightly from the shallow stab wound Melinda had given her. Not enough to kill her, but enough to keep her terrified and weak. Melinda dragged her out of the car again. Shanda's legs buckled immediately. She was 12 years old, barefoot, half-dressed in freezing January temperatures, surrounded by girls who were older, bigger, and all feeding off each other's panic. Lori picked up the violence where Melinda left off. She punched Shanda, grabbed her by the hair, slammed her to the ground. Hope followed her lead, kicking Shanda while she lay curled and pleading. Tony tried again to step back, repeating that they should stop, but the other girls ignored her. The torture wasn't organized. It wasn't planned. It was chaotic, escalating, and fueled by adrenaline. Melinda taunted Shanda about Amanda over and over again, demanding she answer questions she was too terrified to process. Every time Shanda begged for her mother, Melinda's rage sharpened. They beat her until she couldn't stand. They cut her clothes off completely. They mocked her crying, her pleas, her confusion. At one point, Lori wrapped rope around Shanda's wrists and held her upright while Melinda carved shallow slices into her chest, not deep enough to kill her, but deep enough to inflict pain and panic. Shanda begged for her life until she lost her voice, then she whispered for it instead. Lori eventually dragged Shanda by the wrists across the cold ground toward a ditch. The rocks scraped her skin. The cold was numbing her body. She tried to crawl, but she had nothing left in her. They threw her into a pile of brush and leaves, and Lori stood over her. That's when Lori attempted to finish it. She took out the same knife. She stabbed Shanda in the chest again, this time deeper. Then she stabbed her in the neck. Shanda went silent, still breathing, but silent. Lori turned to the others and said she thought Shanda was dead. Hope nodded, eager to believe it was over. Melinda didn't believe it. She wasn't satisfied. She walked over, lifted Shanda's head by the hair, and listened for breathing. Shanda was still alive, barely, but alive. Melinda cursed under her breath. This wasn't over. Not for her, not for Lori, not for any of them. Lori suggested a final step, something permanent, something they couldn't reverse, something she had thought about earlier in the night. They dragged Shanda back to the car, bloody, half-conscious, and unable to speak, and shoved her into the trunk. Shanda made a faint sound, a whimper, a breath, a plea. Lori slammed the trunk shut and drove off. They weren't taking her home. They weren't letting her go. They were driving to a place where they could finish the job the way they wanted. The night wasn't even close to over. The worst was still coming. Lori started driving again, gravel popping under the tires as the car pulled away from the woods. Shanda was in the trunk, bleeding, freezing, fading in and out, but alive. Every bump in the road made her moan. The girls could hear her, and every sound sent a ripple of panic through the group. Tony was crying by now, begging Lori to stop, saying they needed to go to a hospital. Lori snapped at her to shut up. Melinda was furious that Shanda was still alive. Hope was caught somewhere between excitement and fear, still trying to impress everyone by acting unbothered. They drove around aimlessly for a while, arguing about what to do next. Then they saw a convenience store gas station lit up at the end of a quiet stretch of road. Lori pulled in. It was almost surreal. Fluorescent lights, a trash can blowing in the wind, and the four of them stepping out of the car like they were just out for a Friday night drive. While Lori pumped gas, they could all hear Shanda making noises from inside the trunk, weak, muffled, but unmistakably alive. Hope and Melinda started laughing, nervous, mean laughter meant to cover the fact that they didn't know what to do next. Tony broke completely and walked away from the group, sobbing. She knew what was happening, and she knew what was coming next. She begged Lori to stop the night altogether, but Lori just rolled her eyes and said they'd finish it soon. While they were parked there, a man at the pumps glanced over in their direction. Lori froze. Hope froze. Melinda slid into the passenger seat and lowered herself behind the dashboard. They were terrified he'd heard the noises coming from the trunk, but he didn't react. He finished filling his tank, got in his car, and drove off. They got incredibly lucky, terrifyingly lucky. After that close call, Lori said they needed to get far, far away from civilization, somewhere empty, somewhere nobody would stumble across them. She drove them to a remote country road near an old field. The night was so black they could barely see the gravel under their feet when they got out. That's when Shanda started crying in the trunk again, loud enough that it carried. Melinda snapped. She opened the trunk, grabbed the knife again, and stabbed Shanda over and over while she lay crumpled in a corner of the trunk. The blows weren't coordinated or precise. They were frantic, angry, messy. Shanda made a sound so faint it barely registered. She tried to curl up, but she was too weak. Melinda slammed the trunk shut again, but Shanda didn't stop making noise. Lori started driving again, and at one point she deliberately slammed on the brakes and spun the car, trying to knock Shanda unconscious in the trunk. It didn't work. They could still hear her, still breathing. Finally, Lori said what she'd been thinking for hours. "We're burning her." It wasn't said as a suggestion. It was said like a decision. They drove to an empty rural spot, a patch of old farmland with a pile of brush and debris off the main road. The sky was just starting to show a hint of gray on the horizon. They had been torturing Shanda for almost 8 hours. The girls got out. Melinda opened the trunk. Shanda was barely alive, bloody, gasping, unable to move, unable to speak, her body twisted from cold, shock, and injuries. Lori grabbed her under the arms. Hope grabbed her feet. Together, they carried her out of the trunk and laid her on the cold ground near the brush pile. Shanda could not fight. She could not crawl. She could only breathe, ragged, shallow, struggling. Melinda went back to the car, grabbed a bottle of Windex from the back seat, and handed it to Hope. They poured it over Shanda like fuel. Then Lori told Melinda to light her. Melinda struck the match. The fire caught Shanda's shirt first, then spread across her body, and Shanda Sharer, 12 years old, scared, injured, yearning for home, took her last breaths as the flames rose. The girls watched for a moment. Then Lori said, "Let's go." They got back in the car, rolled up the windows, and drove off into the early morning silence. The crime was over, but the consequences were just beginning. As the girls drove away from the field, dawn was creeping up over rural Indiana. The sky was pale and cold. They had been awake all night, running on adrenaline and fear, and none of them fully understood what they'd just done. The car was silent for a long stretch of highway. Melinda stared out the window like she was replaying every moment. Lori gripped the wheel with both hands, eyes fixed straight ahead, acting like she hadn't just led the most brutal crime anyone in that county had ever seen. Hope slumped in her seat, jittery and exhausted. Tony sat stiff and shaking, already falling apart. They weren't done yet. Lori insisted on going back to her house. Her parents were asleep, unaware that their 17-year-old daughter had spent the entire night torturing a 12-year-old child. The girls went into Lori's room, sat on the floor, and laughed and bragged about the night as if it had been some twisted adventure instead of a murder. Hope and Lori retold pieces of it like it was a horror movie they'd starred in. Melinda replayed the moment she confronted Shanda. Tony sat separate from the group, unable to participate, crying quietly and rocking back and forth. A few hours later, Lori and Hope left the house and drove back to the scene because Lori wanted to see the body again. When they arrived, they found Shanda's remains still smoldering. Lori poked at the ashes with a stick, inspecting the damage with a cold detachment that would later horrify investigators. Then she and Hope got back in the car and drove away like it was nothing. Meanwhile, Shanda's mother woke up to find her daughter missing. Shanda hadn't made it home the night before and hadn't called. That wasn't normal. Panic set in fast. She contacted Shanda's father, then the police. At the same time, a man driving past the rural field noticed something strange. A burned pile of brush with what looked like human remains. He called the sheriff immediately. Deputies arrived, took one look at the scene, and knew it was a homicide. The remains were so badly burned they weren't identifiable at first. The only clue was a small patch of fabric that hadn't burned completely, and the fact that the body appeared extremely small. Back at Lori's house, everything began to fracture. Tony couldn't take it anymore. She left, went home, and told her mother what happened. Her mother took her straight to the police station. Tony gave a full statement, names, details, timeline, everything. She broke the entire case open in one afternoon. Police found the burned body that morning and had 3 suspects by evening. Officers went to Lori's house first. She showed no fear. She acted calm, cold, and detached, like the arrest was a minor inconvenience. Melinda cried and tried to blame Amanda. Hope froze up and followed police instructions without saying a word. The girls were interviewed separately. The stories matched in the worst possible way. The brutality, the torture, the fire, the timeline, the knife, Shanda being conscious at every stage. Detectives were horrified. Many had never seen anything like it, especially committed by teenage girls. Shanda's mother was notified later that day. She collapsed when they told her. Her daughter's face was so badly burned they couldn't even use a photograph to identify her. Within 24 hours, the case was national news. Reporters couldn't comprehend how 4 girls from average families without prior violent histories had committed one of the most sadistic murders the region had ever seen. Prosecutors didn't waste time. They charged all 4 girls with murder, criminal confinement, and arson. Because of their ages, none of them faced the death penalty, but they all faced decades behind bars. And beneath all the shock, all the headlines, and all the courtroom chaos, one fact remained. A 12-year-old child had been lured from her home because of jealousy and immaturity, tortured for hours, and burned alive, while the people responsible treated the night like entertainment. The community wasn't just shaken, it was haunted, and the legal system now had to decide what justice looked like for a crime this incomprehensible. The trials that followed were not about mystery, they were not about doubt. They were about trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. 4 teenage girls had taken a 12-year-old child and subjected her to hours of fear, pain, humiliation, and torture, and then tried to burn away the evidence. No courtroom could soften that. No sentencing could undo it. All 4 girls were charged quickly. Prosecutors refused to offer them juvenile deals because the brutality was beyond anything the juvenile system could manage. The decision was unanimous. They would all stand trial as adults. Toni Lawrence was the first to break. She pled guilty to criminal confinement and agreed to testify against the others. She was sentenced to 20 years. She had played the smallest physical role, but fear and silence had still made her part of the night. She carried that guilt for years. Hope Rippey took a plea deal for murder and criminal confinement. She was sentenced to 60 years, with the possibility of parole. Hope had followed more than she had led, but that didn't change the fact that she laughed, participated, and helped carry Shanda to her death. Her actions echoed through the courtroom as the judge addressed her, telling her that being easily influenced did not excuse cruelty. Lori Tackett, the one who drove the car, escalated the violence and suggested burning Shanda alive, was sentenced to 60 years. She showed almost no emotion during her hearing, which made the crime feel even more chilling. Investigators would later say that Lori disturbed them the most, not because she was uniquely evil, but because she seemed so disconnected from the reality of what she had done. Melinda Loveless, the ringleader whose jealousy and rage sparked the entire nightmare, received 60 years as well. Out of all the girls, she showed the most remorse in the years that followed. But remorse after the fact couldn't erase the truth. She had planned to hurt Shanda long before that night ever began, and she never stopped once the violence started. But sentencing is the legal side of the story. The human side is harder. Shanda's mother sat through every hearing. She listened to the details of what was done to her daughter. She had to look at the girls who took Shanda from her, some of them smiling during testimony, some of them crying, all of them old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong. She said the only reason she didn't collapse was because she needed to be present for Shanda, even after death. Shanda's father struggled to comprehend how a group of teenagers could create so much suffering. He talked about her love of school, cheerleading, and animals. He talked about how she was still a child, still scared of the dark sometimes, still sleeping with her door cracked open at home. The court heard about her kindness, her innocence, and the life she should have lived. Those pieces made the brutality even harder to face. Communities in Indiana and Kentucky were shaken to their core. Teachers wept. Counselors questioned how they missed the warning signs. Parents hugged their children tighter. People couldn't understand how a petty teenage conflict had escalated into one of the most sadistic murders in regional history. And the hardest part was this: there was no answer that made sense. Nothing about the crime had logic. Nothing about the night had a reason that justified anything that happened. In the end, the justice system did what it could. It imprisoned the girls for decades. It acknowledged the horror. It tried to close the wound. But a sentence is paperwork. A prison term is structure. None of it brought Shanda back. None of it healed what her family lost. And none of it explained how children could commit a crime so profoundly cruel. The case didn't just scar a community. It forced people to confront the darkest corners of adolescent behavior, group dynamics, and unchecked rage. It forced an entire region to recognize that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a group of kids who never should have been together in the first place. The years that followed didn't soften the crime, but they did reveal its impact in ways no one expected. The case never really faded. It lingered in Indiana and Kentucky like a bruise you can't stop touching. Schools used it as a warning. Counselors studied it. Parents brought it up decades later to explain why they were strict about curfews and friends. It became a symbol of how quickly violence can grow when no one steps in early enough. As the girls entered adulthood behind bars, their lives unfolded in drastically different directions. Toni Lawrence served her time quietly. She avoided conflict, completed programs, and expressed remorse early. She was paroled after roughly 9 years. She kept a low profile after release, carrying the weight of being part of something she couldn't undo. Hope Rippey also eventually earned parole after serving about 14 years. She expressed regret, but that didn't lessen the anger many felt over her role. She reintegrated into society, though the stigma of the case followed her everywhere. Lori Tackett remained the most troubling presence behind bars. Her psychological profile, disciplinary issues, and lack of emotional insight worried everyone involved in her case. She served more than 25 years before being released. Even then, people who remembered the crime watched the news anxiously, knowing how unpredictable she had been as a teenager. Melinda Loveless stayed in prison the longest. Her transformation surprised even the harshest critics. She sought therapy, engaged in programs, and showed deep, ongoing remorse. Over time, she changed in ways the outside world didn't expect. She was polite, disciplined, compliant, and, according to prison staff, genuinely remorseful. But remorse doesn't erase the past. It doesn't bring back a 12-year-old child. Melinda was eventually paroled after serving more than 2 decades. The most human part of this story didn't come from the offenders. It came from Shanda's mother, Jackie Vaught. Jackie carried grief that never fully healed. She described it as waking up every day missing a person who should still be laughing in her house. She kept Shanda's room exactly the same for years. Posters on the wall, stuffed animals arranged neatly, a place frozen in time because moving anything felt like losing her all over again. But in an act no one expected, Jackie did something almost impossible. She forgave one of the girls, not because the crime was forgivable, not because the pain went away, but because the weight of hatred was destroying her more than it was punishing them. Jackie even corresponded with Melinda Loveless in prison. She learned about Melinda's own abuse, her trauma, her spiraling mental health during adolescence. Jackie didn't excuse the crime, but she understood where the darkness came from. At one point, she allowed Melinda to participate in a dog training program that honored Shanda's memory, giving abused dogs a second chance at life. It wasn't grace in the abstract. It was grace that cost her something. Jackie once said, "Forgiving her doesn't change what she did. It changes what the pain does to me." That's the human truth at the center of this case. For the girls, prison sentences marked the end of their involvement. For Shanda's family, the sentence was life without her. And for the region, the case became a permanent warning that violence this extreme doesn't appear out of nowhere. It starts with jealousy, obsession, peer pressure, and the refusal to walk away when you know something is wrong. The legacy of Shanda Sharer isn't the crime itself. It's the community that demanded answers. It's the mother who refused to let hate consume her. It's the reminder that cruelty among kids isn't fiction. It's something adults must notice and intervene in long before it becomes irreversible. Shanda should have grown up. She should have graduated, dated, gone to college, lived a life. Instead, she became the center of a case that still haunts everyone who hears it. And that's why this story still matters, not because it's gruesome, not because it's shocking, but because it forces us to confront a truth most people don't want to think about. Human beings, even young ones, are capable of extraordinary cruelty when left unchecked. But human beings are also capable of extraordinary forgiveness. And somewhere between those two extremes is where the legacy of Shanda Sharer still lives. The murder of Shanda Sharer isn't just a story about 4 violent teenagers. It's a story about all the moments that came before the violence, the ignored warning signs, the escalating jealousy, the peer pressure, the emotional instability, the adults who didn't know what was stirring underneath the surface. It's a reminder that cruelty doesn't always arrive in the form of hardened criminals. Sometimes it shows up in children who feel powerless, angry, abandoned, or desperate for control. Shanda was 12. Her world should have been school dances, cheerleading practice, sleepovers, and crushes. Instead, her name became synonymous with one of the most brutal crimes in regional history. Yet the community didn't let that be the end of her story. Teachers remembered her kindness. Friends remembered her smile. Her mother kept her memory alive through acts of compassion that most people could never imagine making. And decades later, her case still sparks discussions about mental health, adolescent rage, and the responsibility adults have to intervene when young people spiral. There are no answers big enough to explain this crime. There is no justice clean enough to fix it. But there is a truth worth holding on to. Shanda wasn't defined by the night she died. She was defined by the life she lived, short, bright, and loved, and by the strength of a mother who refused to let her legacy be swallowed by hate. This is why we tell these stories, not to sensationalize, not to glorify violence, but to remember the victims, confront the failures, and shine a light on the parts of our society where darkness grows in silence. Shanda deserves so much more than what happened to her, and remembering her is the closest thing the world can offer to the justice she never received. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, make sure you follow, rate, and share the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. It helps keep these stories alive and brings more attention to the victims history tried to bury. Research and narration is always done by me. Sources for this episode include court transcripts, police reports, archived news coverage from the Louisville Courier-Journal, Indianapolis Star, and official sentencing documents from the Indiana Department of Corrections. Deadly Truths is written and produced independently, clearly. And remember, the past isn't gone, it's just waiting to be dug up in the bluegrass.